Well, it's been a while since I've gotten into any kind of a study that would be something that would take us through at least a few months and some other details on it. But before we do that, I just want to open with prayer. So, Father, we want to thank you for the blessings that you give to us every day, and the blessing that it is to be part of your family, to be redeemed, to be reconciled. We're in the process of that, for taking us into a future that is far beyond our comprehension. We thank you for all that you have provided for us in the way of your Spirit dwelling in us, in the way of Christ and the sacrifice that he's given to us so that we can have that relationship with you and to understand and comprehend more fully the grace, the mercy, the long suffering, and the goodness and truth that you embody. We ask you to help us to have the words to say today, and also the ears to hear, and the things that you've prepared, and that you would be glorified throughout all of our fellowship, and throughout whatever we produce in this world, and as we walk out the things we learn. So we thank you for all this in Christ's name. Amen. So last time we had been together, it's been a while. I think it's been over a year now. I had so many things transpiring in my life, as far as me being in your presence in Brockport and going through a study. And we went through the book of Proverbs from a little different way. We didn't take it verse by verse, but I went and spoke about the book of Proverbs and talked about some of the different things that were in there, such as righteousness versus wickedness. And if you recall, the book of Proverbs was a book of comparison. It was about the difference between good and evil. And we used some of the examples of you could not really understand light if all there was darkness, or vice versa. You would not be able to comprehend darkness if there was no light. So that's the idea behind the book of Proverbs. And as it starts out in chapter 1 and verse 7, and with the statement, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And we talked a little bit about the fact that it's not a fear to be afraid of, but it's the reverence, the respect of God. And the fear of the Lord is presenting him from a way that we respect and honor him, and that's where our knowledge actually begins. And then in chapter 2, verse 1 through 11 of Proverbs, you don't have to turn there. I'll just read some of it. I have most of my notes in the King James, and I can read from the other translations, but let me do that. Chapter 2, verse 1 through 11 of Proverbs shows you this idea of an if-then response, which, if we look back, an if-then response, or if you do this, then this is the result, it's always ending up in a covenant relationship type of thing. And it states, "My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments within you, make your ear attentive to wisdom and incline your heart to understanding. Yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver." And in the King James, it would say, if you seek her, using a female form of wisdom. If you seek it like silver and search for it as hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright, and he is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity and every good path. For wisdom will come into your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant unto your soul. Discretion will watch over you, and understanding will guard you. Now you can see a lot of that we have in here. It's all these sayings and these statements are not only an if, and then there's two thens in there in that particular passage, but there's also a lot of listed about knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. And I explained a little bit about my perception of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Knowledge is knowing what's right. Wisdom is acting out on that knowledge or doing what's right, living what's right. And we went into a little bit in the past about James. James talked about the fact that we have not the hearers, but the doers are justified. So you can see that idea that it's not just the knowledge, but it's what you do with that knowledge and living it out and presenting that in your life to other people. And then the understanding is the third leg of that table, so to speak, where understanding comes in where with your perception of why those things are right. So it's a process, knowing what's right, doing what's right, and then the perception of why it's right to do it and live it. And a lot of that doesn't come unless we actually live out that process. So Colossians 1 and verse 9, Paul actually used this when he was praying, or used an example also and told the Colossians what he prayed about. Colossians 1 and verse 9 says that for this cause, we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you and desire that you be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding or spiritual intellect. So even Paul went into that idea of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. And I mentioned that too. Paul had mentioned that quite a few times. But we have to understand there were 3 books that Solomon wrote. And as I was trying to develop this study, what I guess I should say and state is that we want to talk and converse here about the book of Ecclesiastes next, because we went over Proverbs. So I wanted to give you a little background, and some of you did not hear any of the message on Proverbs, to give you a background of what Proverbs was. And then we moved to the book of Ecclesiastes. And after Ecclesiastes, Solomon wrote the Song of Songs. And if you know any of my work or are familiar with any of the things that I've done and in the background, you may be familiar with some of the things I've done with the Old Testament. The Old Testament was something that I was in the Worldwide Church of God years and years ago. And we kept a lot of the Old Testament laws, the feast days, the holy days. And there were a lot of things I learned from that. So when I started to speak at Brockport, I went to some of the things that were familiar to me and how the holy days actually correlate to a lot of the, not a lot, but all of the, in my opinion and theory, theology. I believe that all of the holy days are just laid out as a pattern of God's plan of salvation for all mankind. And Hosea speaks of the Lord will come to us as the former and latter rain. So the former rains were already fulfilled in the first 3 holy days. And some of the things that are broken up in the holy day period, they don't usually, a lot of Christians don't understand them and comprehend them. And there was something that I just wanted to read because I've spoken on these things, and someone had sent an email to me. It said, I just want to thank you, let you know that I appreciate all you've taught over the years concerning the law and its feasts and sacrifices, etc. You've raised my awareness, the details of the law, and it causes me to pay closer attention when I am reading, instead of wondering why so much of the Old Testament was devoted to the law. Is starting to recognize its importance and the substance that it pointed to. And that's the idea behind it. I started to realize a lot of those things too as I was studying them out, not just the holy days, but how the sacrifices all play into the different holy days. And the burnt offering being a complete sacrifice. The grain offering being something that would correlate to the days of unleavened bread. And that the days of unleavened bread was a 7-day holy day period, that unleavened means to be free from sin. And that is a period that takes a whole lifetime for us to overcome and get to the point where we are free from sin and have that sin weeded out and taken out of our life, because leaven permeates everything, or sin as it's correlated to in the scriptures. And then you move to the Feast of Pentecost, and Pentecost was always represented by a unity, brethren dwelling together and God being at one with them. Not in the same way as atonement, but there are correlations between that. And the peace offering was something that was also the third sacrifice of the 5 sacrifices, also correlated with the Pentecost idea that in the peace offering, the priest, the offerer, and God all partook of that offering inside the temple or in the court. So it was something that was all enjoined together, and it represented unity. And then the other idea was the Lord would come to us as the latter rain, which was all the fall holy days. And if you're not familiar with that, I was thinking that sometime we could go over some of those things. There were a lot of things that I started to put together and piece together. That the tabernacle even is laid out in 3 parts: the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. And I gave a message quite a while ago and spoke about the 3 different parts and how they all are symbolized by many, many things that are in Scripture. There were 3 metals that were used in the construction of the tabernacle: brass, silver, and gold. And this construction all represented certain things. Brass was the metal of judgment. Silver is the metal of redemption. Gold is the metal of deity. So as you move through the tabernacle, you get into these different parts. There's this idea of death, burial, and resurrection, that the gospel by which Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, he delivered to the Corinthians, and as well as all Christians through his writing, was the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And that's all represented in those parts of the tabernacle. In the outer court was the part where the sacrifices took place. That was where judgment took place. That was the death part of Christ's offering. And then the holy place was the part where you got into the burial. And when we talk about the burial of Christ was a process. It was 3 days long. It's also this understanding that your sanctification, because you can get into the idea of justification, sanctification, glorification with these 3 parts of the tabernacle. And you want to start to understand that this sanctification process, or the burial process, was a period that it wasn't instantaneous. The same thing with the unleavened bread idea. It takes a lifetime to rid yourself of all of these things. Paul spoke about this in Colossians 3 and verse 5, to mortify the members of your body that are on the earth. And he went through a whole list of things that we should get rid of, put off these things Paul said, put on bowels of mercy and other things that are more important. That's a process. And that's why you can see why this period of burial was 3 days. And then there's the resurrection. The resurrection is the Holy of Holies. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. And everything in there was gold. So that's also where the glorification happens. So it's a process, and I began to see some of those things and how important it was to tie that all together, and also the idea of a Jewish wedding ceremony, or the wedding ceremony as it's laid out in Scripture. And it's really important to understand some of that and how that all ties into this idea of the Feast of Tabernacles. Feast of Tabernacles is the one of the fall festivals. You have trumpets, or Yom Teruah, and then you have Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And I've spoken often of the Day of Atonement and the idea of reconciliation with that process. And then you have the Feast of Tabernacles, and even John in chapter 1 spoke of the Feast of Tabernacles, or Christ as part of a tabernacle, so to speak, because he mentions that in verse 14 of chapter 1 that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, or the word in translation as it's translated dwelt is tabernacle. And tabernacle, in the Feast of Tabernacles, was more of a temporary dwelling. It was the idea that people would leave their homes and go to a place of God's choosing, and they would set up these tents or these temporary dwellings. And our homes that we live in are more of a permanent dwelling for us. And if we go to a hotel somewhere, we know it's a temporary dwelling. And it's this idea of getting us to the understanding that our lives here are temporary dwellings. So that's the whole idea behind the tabernacle. Christ came and he dwelt with us temporarily to get us to understand some things. So when we get to the idea of the author, or coming to the author of these 3 books, it was written by Solomon. If you go back to 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 12, I think a lot of us are familiar with the story. God appeared to Solomon in a dream, told him that he would give him whatever request that he wanted. And Solomon asked for an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this so great a people? Solomon was obviously overwhelmed by the task of ruling and reigning and being king over God's people. So it was a wise thing that he asked for. He asked for wisdom. And then in verse 12, it said, behold, I have done according to your words. Lo, I've given you a wise and an understanding heart, so that there is none like you before you, and neither shall there be any that arise like you after you. And over in chapter 4, verse 29 of 1 Kings, it states, and God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding exceeding much, and largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore. And Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men. And then in the end of verse 31, it says, and his fame was in all nations round about. Wisdom that Solomon had was in all nations round about. Now, I want to discuss some of these things, but I want to lay it out because the Jews read the book of Ecclesiastes during the time of the Festival of Tabernacles. And I think there's an important reason for that. There's a lot of correlations between the two events. The book of Ecclesiastes follows the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs, I said, was more of a covenant relationship and an if-then and a comparison between these things, that if you do that, then you're going to be blessed. And the idea of all of that is interesting. But when you come to the book of Ecclesiastes, there's a different approach to it. The book of Ecclesiastes gives you this idea that just because you do certain things, the result is not guaranteed. It has a different approach to it. And a lot of people look at this and say, well, it's helping us to understand certain aspects of wisdom. But when it comes to the theme and the things that are discussed in the book and how they correlate to the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Tabernacles, as I had stated, was a temporary dwelling. It gives you this idea in Ecclesiastes that the race is not always to the swift. And I just want to turn over there to read from that particular section, Ecclesiastes chapter 9. And verse 11. Solomon wrote, I returned and I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. In other words, what he's trying to say is, and you could watch the Olympics and see, for example, Usain Bolt from Jamaica in the 100-yard dash. Fastest man on the face of the planet. Swiftest man on the face of the planet. However, what would happen if the gun went off and he tripped out of the starting blocks? He would not win the race. So Solomon is starting to give this idea that just because you're the fastest doesn't mean that you're going to win the race. Just because you do everything that is right doesn't mean that you're going to always succeed. Sometimes there's a vanity, as he puts it, a uselessness, as he writes in Ecclesiastes, to some of these things. The battle is not always to the strong, or bread to the wise, or riches to men of understanding, or favor to men of skill, but time and chance happens to everyone. So this idea of the book of Ecclesiastes, the major theme would be that the futility of mundane pursuits and pleasures and the search for deeper meaning of life all correlate to this idea of the Feast of Tabernacles. The Festival of Ingathering is another term for it. When the crops, it was always a fall festival when the crops were all brought in. So all of the festivals that God has ordained in his word in the Old Testament all revolve around harvest periods. And the biggest harvest is the one in the fall. The Feast of Ingathering is another term for it. That's when they were to take all of their crops and the tithe of all of their goods, their animals and everything. And if they couldn't journey with all of that to enjoy it at the feast, they were supposed to turn that in for money and then enjoy the feast that way. It's commanded in Deuteronomy 14, verse 23 through 26, it says, "You shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain, your new wine, your oil, the firstborn of your herds and flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord always. And if the journey is too long for you, you're not able to carry that tithe, then you take and you turn it in for exchange it for money, and take the money in your hand to the place where God chooses, and you shall spend the money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep, for wine or similar drink, and for whatever your heart desires, that you shall eat before the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household." And then in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 10 through 13, there's a very similar statements. It says that I have seen the God-given task which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work of God does from beginning to end. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all of his labor, for it is the gift of God. So you can start to see why the Jews would read the book of Ecclesiastes at this time. The Feast of Tabernacles they were commanded to rejoice. And who wouldn't rejoice when you have a tenth of all of your labor for that year tied up in just 7 days to worship and praise and do those things before God to wherever he chooses to place his name. But I wanted to correlate, because I did it with the tabernacle, the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies, to 3 time periods that I think represent the 3 books that Solomon wrote. Proverbs would correlate to the outer court, which would also correlate to what I would consider this present evil age, this time period that we're in now. The idea that you have this correlation between good and evil, the knowledge, and where you get that from is you can go all the way back to the garden of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That it's the kingdom of the adversary. It's also tied into 3 of the kings of Israel. And I spoke one time about names, and this is important too. We have Saul, David, and Solomon in the 3 different kingdom periods. But Ecclesiastes would be tied into this second part of the tabernacle, which is represented by the millennium. The Feast of Tabernacles has always represented this 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now, David was a type of Christ. Solomon was also a type of Christ. Ecclesiastes gets into this understanding that that's the book that is going to be the wisdom that is used during that period of time. The wisdom that's used in the present evil age would be the one of the if-then, of the correlation, of understanding. You can't really understand light without darkness. The final book that Solomon wrote was the Song of Songs, or I'll call it the Age of All Ages. That's the idea behind the final holy day, or the 8th day, which a lot of people don't comprehend. They think it's part of the Feast of Tabernacles, but it's not listed as it's listed as a separate holy day altogether. And Dan Haley gave a message on the Song of Songs. One time I thought it was very, very interesting, because it gives this idea of it starts out with this thought process, my beloved is mine. In other words, it's from the female voice speaking that my beloved belongs to me. And it moves through this process to understand that at the end, I belong to him. So you have these 3 books that he wrote, and you have these 3 kings. Saul's name, the King Saul, Saul means asked for. And if you recall, what did the people want? They requested of Samuel that they did not want God to rule over them. They wanted a king to rule over them like the other nations of the world. So they were the ones that asked for a king, and God gave them Saul. David's name means beloved, which is interesting because he's the 8th son of Jesse, and it was a new beginning for the kingdom to have an individual that is beloved of God. This was a king that God had chosen. And then the final king was Solomon, and Solomon's name means peace. And that's when there's total unity between God and man. It's very difficult to explain all of this without being able to put it up on a chart or to give you some other information. But I wanted to do some of that to hope that you can see all of that. Proverbs, the if-then. Ecclesiastes is not always an if-then. If you do certain things, this is going to turn out. And then the Song of Songs of the final ability of a person to realize that I don't possess God, God possesses me. I belong to him. And that's the idea behind the whole 3 of those books. The other 3s that I had written down one time, you have, as you move through the tabernacle process, you have knowledge, wisdom, understanding, knowing what's right, living what's right, and then perception of why. So this same thing with the idea of the death, burial, and resurrection. When you know what's right, what is the knowledge? The knowledge of what Christ has done for us. So then we move through that to this holy place of where is wisdom? Wisdom is doing what's right, living right. And also then the final phase of it is the understanding of why it's right. And that's where the Song of Songs would be. Why is it right? Why are all of these things transpiring? And you can see in the book of Ecclesiastes, what you end up with is a lot of, not just a proverb is a short saying. Ecclesiastes goes in more into a story, gives you a little bit more of a background and tells you what's going on. There's one example, and we will go through this. There was a king that built bulwarks against a city. And the city listened to the wisdom of a poor man. And then they were saved from that king that was attacking the city by this poor man's wisdom. And yet the poor man was then disregarded. And why? So there's a more of a story form in which he lays some of this out. And then you have the idea behind the good, acceptable, perfect, faith, expectation, and love. These are all other groups of 3 that are laid out through that tabernacle layout. I mentioned David and Solomon because King Saul represents this present evil age. David and Solomon pair as a type of Christ in his future reign upon the earth. And there's a thought that everyone in a typical Christianity believes that we're going to heaven. when the real idea is that heaven or God's kingdom is going to come here. So together, David and Solomon represent aspects of Christ's future work. First, the warfare against his enemies and putting them down, that would be under David's reign. And if you understand any of David's life, David had the kingdom divided when he first took over and had to unify it and had to go through and fight the Philistines and all of those things that he battled early in his life, killing Goliath. And then you have immediately following a wonderful time of peace and prosperity, which was pictured by the kingdom of Solomon. David did all the preliminary work, and then Solomon came into an area where the kingdom was all taken care of for him. All of the battles were over, and the wisdom of Solomon then was revealed to not just Solomon's people, not just the people of Israel, but as it states in 1 Kings, that it was throughout all nations of the earth. All nations understood that. And these are the things that I've seen as these kingdom periods coming down to earth. Tying it into the wedding ceremony is another aspect altogether. The idea of the wedding ceremony representing the Feast of Tabernacles period, or the kingdom of David, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, we'll say, which really is a reign of a representative of Christ, not Christ himself. I have many other beliefs that are different than majority of mainstream Christianity because of the things I've seen through God laying out these processes of the tabernacle and his holy day process, and also the sacrifices. But this process of the wedding ceremony was when the bridegroom came for his bride, it was usually at nighttime, and there were trumpets blown, and he took his bride into the huppah, or the wedding chamber. And at that period of time, there was a call to go out for the guests of the wedding to gather, and that took 7 days. They were celebrating the wedding ceremony that had taken place between the bride and the bridegroom for 7 days. That's the period of time of the Feast of Tabernacles. It was 7 days long. And then on the 8th day, the bride and the bridegroom would come out of their wedding chamber and celebrate with all of the guests that had been gathered. And that's why the Feast of Tabernacles is also called the Feast of Ingathering, and that the 8th day is represented by the Great White Throne Judgment. There's an interesting correlation too with the Kingdom of Solomon and what we make and call on the 8th day, because in 1 Kings, chapter 10, speaks about Solomon and the throne that he made. Moreover, the king, in verse 18 of chapter 10 of 1 Kings, moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory. What is ivory? What color is it? It's white. A great throne of ivory. So it's correlating right back to Revelation 20 and verse 11 of the Great White Throne period. That's why I say Solomon's reign, even though Solomon's life didn't end the way we would picture the reign of Christ, he was given wisdom, understanding, and largeness of heart to rule over the people and rule over a kingdom that was filled with peace and prosperity. And that's the time period also when a lot of nations came to hear of the wisdom of Solomon And that's the period of time that I believe correlates with that great white throne after the 1,000-year reign. That's the period of time when the bride and the bridegroom exit the wedding chamber and the New Jerusalem comes to earth, and all of those things take place. But in the meantime, what we have tasked with is to take a look at the book of Ecclesiastes, because that's the time frame that I believe correlates with the Feast of Tabernacles, or the 1,000-year reign of Christ, or Christ's representative, represented also by King David. I hope some of this makes sense. If anybody has any questions on it, they may arise. There's a lot of information there that I haven't had the time to go over the background. I know that some of you have heard me speak on these subjects over the years before, and how they all correlate, but hopefully that would be all straightened out in time. And if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. If you don't have my email, somebody does. I know a lot of people would have that opportunity. I just wanted to read something about this from the book of Ecclesiastes just before we get into this in our next study. In the introduction, it says, life seems inconsistent, unpredictable, and unfair at times, regardless of the generation, regardless of time and history, or the righteousness and the wicked, and they have the same experiences. They face the same trials. They grapple with the same problems, and all end up in the same place, and that's the grave. As people grow older, they look back at life and they think it's but a breath, it's but a vapor. It passes so quickly. And what's the purpose of it? Have we sought after the right things? Have we lived the life that we should? What does man gain by all of the toil at which he toils under the sun? And what is the conclusion of all of it? Ecclesiastes not only asks these questions, but also points toward the answers. So I don't want to take up much more time, but I do want to read the first 3 verses and the last 2 of the book to kind of give us an idea of where we're going and what will be the outcome of all of it. Verse 1 through 3 of chapter 1 states, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So right away, a lot of people will say, well, this wasn't Solomon. This is another person that had used his information and put that down. But I think it's pretty obvious. The words of the preacher, the son of David. Who's the son of David? That would be king in Jerusalem. There's only one of those. That was Solomon. And then verse 2 says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And that word hevel just means smoke, emptiness, uselessness, futility. Smoke is something you can see, but you can't put your hand on it. It dissipates, it's gone. He, in other times during the book, calls it life is a vapor. A vapor is something that you can boil water in a pot and you can see the steam come off of it, but how long does that steam last? It disappears really quick. And James also mentions that too. Our life is a vapor. Our life is like the grass of the field, here today, gone tomorrow. So in verse 3, it says, what does man gain by all the toil or all the work at which he works under the sun? So his life is spent in work, and what's the gain of that? What's the end of it? What's the purpose of all of this that we suffer and go through? So some of those things are answered. There's a couple of different parts of the book. Part of the book looks at life from man's perspective with a uselessness, and part of it is answered by God's perspective of what man should be doing and how man should look at life and approach it. Because like it says, the race is not always to the swift. But what do you do when it doesn't work out the way you think? Do you fall apart? There's also parts of the book that are very interesting because it says that when we enter the house of mirth, we should be joyful. So when we go to a party, we're not supposed to be the Debbie Downer at the party. We're supposed to have a good time at a party. That's what celebrations are for. But it also states in correlating the next part of that, when you enter the house of mourning, that you should consider. And you just don't fall apart. And you don't always ask, why is this happening? But you ask, what's going on? To consider, to contemplate, because the house of mourning is a place of trial, testing, suffering. So in the end of the book, just so we don't, because some parts of it can be very depressing. Chapter 12 and verse 13 and 14. Chapter 12 and verse 13 says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. In the King James, it puts it as, this is the conclusion. Let us hear the conclusion of this. What should we do because of all of this? Fear God or respect God, obey his words, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether it's good or evil. And I can think of the bema seat of Christ that Paul spoke about in 1 Corinthians 3. That we're all going to stand before that and receive a reward. So that's hopefully helping us understand why the book is read during the Feast of Tabernacles, the correlation that's made between that, why the Feast of Tabernacles, where it plays into or sits in the overall plan of God for the salvation of man, and what we should be gleaning from the book as we go through there. And that's where I want to leave it for today. And next time we'll go through, hopefully it'll only take us a couple of Bible studies. We'll go through some of the highlights of the book and some of my favorite verses in there, such as chapter 8 and verse 11. It's always been a favorite of mine. But anyhow, as you read through it and you get to know it a little bit, hopefully that'll help you out. So see you next time.